With the $700 7950X now behind us and the 7600X behind us at $300, it's time to look at the 7900X. This is a 12-core, 24-thread part. It is priced at $550, and it's replacing the likes of the 5900X and the 3900X before it. We have a lot of benchmarks for this one. We're going to focus on production, but also talk about gaming, because as you would expect, 7950 is super overkill for gaming to the point that it's actually worse sometimes than lower-end AMD CPUs. We'll see if this fits in the same category or if it starts to sort of tip into the positive side of not quite diminishing returns. Let's get started with the 7900X. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Height Y60. The Height Y60 is one of the most unique cases to launch anytime recently, coming in multiple color options like this bright red, and it's also built for both water cooling and air cooling. The case pays extreme attention to detail, particularly with cable management paths like you can see with the quality rubber grommets that are always passed through, and with split lower and upper chambers. Learn more at the link in the description below. So as with the last few videos, we're not going to go through all the specs and everything. We already did that in a news video. It's linked below if you want to check it out. This is strictly focused on performance and the value consideration. Additionally, we have the 7950X review up as our first set of these 4 reviews that contain some background information on testing methodology, changes to our test bench, and things you need to know about Zen 4 and Ryzen 7000 CPUs. Again, including that thermal boosting behavior with the whole 95 degrees Celsius thing. Check the other 2 videos for that. So let's get started with thermals and frequency to look at how far this one boosts up when it's able to more or less fully unlock itself under a 360 mil AIO, and then we'll go from there. We now return to the thermal and frequency chart. It's very important that you at least check out the 7950X review thermal section for foundational information here, because it's a lot different than previous Ryzen generations. The 7950X sets the stage by blazing in at 95 degrees Celsius and a 21C ambient within just 8 seconds of the workload starting. It truly has no chill. And that's what, well, except for when we put it under liquid nitrogen later. But anyway, it has no chill right now. And that's what allows the 5078 to 5100 megahertz all-core clock. That's under, currently, a 360 millimeter liquid freezer 2 at 100% fan speed, so the behavior scales all the way up to some of the best liquid coolers. The 7900X is the new one to this chart, and it has a more wobbly beginning, eventually settling on a 92 degrees Celsius for T-die. AMD told us that the boost is up to 90 to 95C, so that's within the expected range. The only variable left is power budget, other than maybe silicon quality. So lower-end CPUs may boost higher than higher-end SKUs, contingent on the thermal solution. And here's where we see that. The clock on the 7900X boosts to an average of 5122 to 5180 megahertz throughout our test, putting it upwards of 100 megahertz higher than the 7950X. So what this tells us is that if you see the 7900X outperform a 7950X in some tests, or the same is true for the other CPUs as well, then don't be surprised, because under identical coolers, the 7900X has better thermal headroom to continue boosting, and with the silicon quality, at least, of our 2 units, the 7950, 7900X, we end up with the 7900X boosting higher in some cases than the 7950, and that means that in scenarios that are not entirely thread-bound, where the 7950 poses no additional value, the frequency is going to win, and the frequency is higher on the 7900X. Therefore, seeing them kind of change places on the stack shouldn't be too surprising. It does entirely depend on the workload, though. Won't always happen. It's not quite that simple. And this really does come down to thermal headroom and boosting ability you have from your cooler and the rest of your system. Here's the chart with steady-state thermals for all sensors exposed by AMD. The 7900X is in red. Average T-die was 92 degrees, like we saw earlier. More interestingly, the largest core-to-core delta on the 7900X is 15.6 degrees. That's between core 5 and core 0. That's not as wide as the 20-degree range that we saw with the 7950X, but it still means that there's some room for lapping to improve the contact area and reduce the deltas. Since this boosts to the hottest single core, that extra headroom will help if we can bring down the hottest core to be closer in line with the others. Here's the single core frequency chart. The 7950X ran at about 5750 megahertz with only 1 core active, with the 7900X pushing to about 5700 megahertz. There's a 50 megahertz loss here, although it does better in an all core. Time to look at the power consumption for the 7900X. For this one, we are isolating the CPU power at the EPS 12-volt cables, which means we're not factoring in any of the other major components in the system, so we can look at just what is the CPU draw for power and get a better idea for that magical efficiency mark that AMD keeps talking about. The R9 7900X consumed about 200 watts during the course of work, as compared to AMD's mystical TDP number. That means nothing to anybody except maybe OEMs trying to shoehorn old cooler specs into new CPUs. We're obviously a little bit higher. The 7900X's result has at about the same power consumption as an FX 9590, although clearly the new one is completing an amount of work more than the 9590 that we can only quantify as infinite. The 7950X is still sitting higher than even this, with its 33% more cores and other changes demanding an additional 26% more power. It's not bad scaling, but 250 watts is still enough to impact power supply and cooler choice, at least at an absolute level, even if the scaling is kind of okay. The 7900X is doing better here than the 12900K, but is worse off than the 133 watt 5900X or 120 watt 5950X previously. Single core consumption in a one-core workload with Cinebench has the 7900X at 49 watts, about the same as the 7950X and the FX 9590. But it's more than the 3900X's 43 watts and the 5900X's 38 watts previously. The 12900K also does better here, down at 41 watts, perhaps making a case for Intel efficiency in limited thread scenarios. Similar to the 7950X, the 7900X CPU is clearly more targeted towards the what we call production users. That would be someone who does things in addition to gaming. The marketing word is creator, and it has been for quite some time now. But you could do other stuff that, I don't know, everything's creation, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, they call it creation, but if you do any kind of code compile, Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, compression, decompression, stuff like that, this is gonna matter more on the 7900X than it will on the lower end CPUs. We'll start here, especially at the $550 price point. That puts it more in competition with something like a 12900K, which is a fairly direct price competitor. And then AMD's older stuff like the 5950X you should be paying attention to as well. Let's get into some charts. Blender's up first, where we use an in-house benchmark built for stressing CPUs. This chart is represented as render time in minutes, with lower being better. The 7900X completed the render in 8 minutes, with the 16-core 7950X completing 2 minutes faster. That's a 25% reduction versus the 7900X. That's with a core count increase of about 33%, so it's a non-linear gain for the increase, but it's still a predictable one. The 12900K and 5950X come just behind at 9.2 and 9.4 minutes, establishing a lead in the 7900X of about 14% between either of these options. For perspective, if you were rendering enough frames that it'd take, let's say, 24 hours to complete on a 12900K, the 7900X would complete the same work in about 20 and a half hours instead, where the 7950X would complete that same work in 18 hours. So these differences at the minute level, they start to add up fast when calculating against regular production class workloads, like rendering an entire animation. The higher clock speed and architecture improvements of Zen 4 are paying off here, shown in the 5900X versus 7900X, and the 7900X requires 29% less time than the 5900X. So it is better. So AMD made a lot of claims in its presentation. We talked about those in the 7950X review about efficiency, and depending on how you look at it, they're kind of accurate. It's just that they really present the CPUs in a light that is maybe more positive than perhaps reality does. That needed something on it. It was bothering me. So the 7900X, in terms of efficiency strictly, what we're looking at is a scenario where the absolute power consumption has increased substantially. So even if it's maybe more efficient, depending on how you calculate it in some scenarios, that doesn't change the fact that the power consumption is very high now. So you will need to be factoring in power supply choice a little bit more carefully than perhaps in previous years, especially with the 40 series coming out. Additionally, it means you need to factor in the cooler, because more power into the CPU, it has to go somewhere. And at least until this can move or transform or I guess glow, the only place it goes is basically heat, and that's going to be absorbed by the cooler. So with the blender results and the power numbers in, we can calculate the efficiency now, and the unit of work we're going to use to calculate the efficiency to validate AMD's claims is going to be 1 frame rendered. So it's a fixed unit of work for all CPUs, and then we're measuring the time required for that fixed unit of work against the power consumed during the process. Pretty easy, but it's basically just watt hours. The 7900X ranked at 26.5 watt hours per frame here, which put it within the same class as the top performers on the chart. Same for the 5950X, which is the current efficiency champion with an 18.9 marker. The 7900X significantly leads the notoriously power-hungry 12900K's 37.4 watt hour per frame marker, and that lead narrows when looking at the comparatively lower power Alder Lake parts like the 12700KF at 28.9 watt hours per frame. AMD's 7000 generation ties with some of the 5000 generation, but it's made to look bad by AMD's own 5950X flagship previously. Next is Chromium Code Compile. The 7900X posted a time of 46.5 minutes to compile the code, reduced to 19% by the 7950X at 37.5 minutes. Both IPC and clock speed benefit the 7900X over the 5900X, where the 7900X comes out about 25% improved or faster. The 7900X represents a good value at the high end, besting the 12900K and the 5950X, both of which have come down in price but started out much higher. The 7-zip is up now. This test allows us to evaluate compression and decompression workloads on CPUs, measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. The 7950X sets the top bar for the chart at 194K MIPS. This has it 18% ahead of the 7900X's performance, which itself is 18% ahead of the previous 5950X flagship, although AMD hasn't beaten its own 5950X for overall power efficiency in this test either. Versus older generations, the 7900X leads the 5900X by 34% or so, with the 3900X at 109K MIPS being improved upon by 51%. Intel's 12900K ends up below the newer R9 CPUs, but above the 7600X. In decompression, the 7900X ran below the 5950's 221K MIPS result. We've already seen that this test benefits higher core count CPUs, further evidenced in the comparison of the 5600X versus the 3700X previously. The newer architectures have limited benefit as compared to older options with higher core and thread count. We're going to go shorthand for these. The 79X's result still places it 18% ahead of the 59X's 179K MIPS, and well ahead of Intel's 151K MIPS, posting a 40% lead in decompression overall. That's a big gap for similar cost, putting AMD in an advantaged position versus the most recent competition. However, Intel has 13th gen in the wins, so we'll see if that changes soon. The 7950X posts massive gains over even these 79X numbers, so anyone doing serious and frequent compression and decompression should consider the 16-core options. Now for the Adobe suite, the root of all evils in our company, Adobe Premiere. For this set of tests, we combine testing results from various aspects of Premiere to create an overall score via the Puget Bench. This includes filters, renders, and scrubbing. Thus far, the chart hasn't shown much deviation between the 129K and the 7950X, despite a slight lead for AMD. That trend continues down to the 79X, which ends up about the same in performance as the 129K, while being priced about the same. The 79X improves over the 59X by only 11%, with the 39X allowing an uplift of 17%. Intel and AMD have similar behavior in modern Adobe Suite tests, unlike the early Zen generations where Intel had a stronghold here. Photoshop shouldn't be too much different except for one thing. You can see the 7900X is almost, confusingly maybe, ahead of the 7950X. But we looked into this, and after realizing that it wasn't a test error, we noticed that it's because of that frequency change we saw earlier, where the 7900X consistently runs a little bit higher in clocks, upwards of 100 megahertz or so, and that higher frequency over the 7950 benefits it in Photoshop more than the extra cores would. Now it's time to get into the gaming benchmarks. Quick reminder again, if you see the 7900X pull ahead of like the 7950, that doesn't necessarily mean anything other than it's boosting a little bit higher. It can also be error. They're very close together sometimes, and especially if we get into GPU bound scenarios, then the numbers are all a wash. So let's get started though with some easier benchmarks. In CSGO, the 79X ran at 421 FPS average, which puts the 7950X only 3.6% ahead. Not worth it for the price jump, but we sort of knew that since it's a production CPU anyway. Compared to the 76X gaming class CPU from AMD, the 7900X's lead is 10%. at 421 FPS average over 383 FPS. That's looking impressive, but realistically, whether or not you can feel that change depends on how good of a player you are. As for lows, they're all spaced proportionally to the results, except the 7900X and the 7950, which have stronger 1% results than the 7600X. Intel's 129K lands further down the stack, allowing the 79X a lead of 12%, and with lows spaced proportionally for the average. Generationally, the 79X leads the 59X by 23%, with the lead over the 39X at an impressive 80%. So as a gaming-capable production CPU, it's doing well. There was a time with Zen 1, for example, and the first round of Threadripper, where AMD's CPUs had too high of a core count to the extent that it was actually confusing some of the games, and they had to introduce a gaming mode that turned off half of the cores, and that Intel's marketing arm benchmarking firm, Principal Technologies, later used in its benchmarks to represent AMD in a very poor light. But we're well past that at this point. The 12 core part here doesn't really have any meaningful thread scheduling issues, doesn't have any major game launching issues. That's all been resolved years and years ago now. Now, if you are gaming on a strict budget, this is also a good reminder that on that chart, the 12100F is still an extremely strong performer, and it's $100. So it gets about 61% or so of the performance of the 7900X, while being about 18% of the price. Pretty good trade-off, not as powerful, certainly not that good for production class work, but if you don't do much of it and all you do is game, we're just trying to make sure everyone remembers that you don't have to buy the best thing or feel pressure to buy it. If you just need to play games, you can get in far cheaper than that. But the 7900X is overall good, so credit to it there. 1440p isn't any different, but that's a good thing. As we said in the last few reviews, this illustrates that we're actually bound on the CPU. We can see real differences in CPU choice all the way up to at least 1440p here, but most games would become bound by the GPU at this point. In at least CSGO, ultra-competitive types will get benefit from the 7900X and the 7950X alike, although most people will be bottlenecked on skill before they're bottlenecked on the CPU, but they do scale all the way up. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the 79X ran at 606 FPS average, about the same as the 7950X, which plotted 607. The 5800X 3D is also just behind, as is the 7600X with its 603 FPS result, and the lows are nearly identical between all of these CPUs, with only the 12900K running ahead of the new AMD lineup and the 5800X 3D. From a value standpoint, that basically eliminates the 79X for a pure gaming CPU in this use case, because the 76X gets all the performance for a far lower price. Generationally, the 7900X outperforms the 5900X's 592 FPS average results by 12%, and it leads the 39X by 36%. Now in Rainbow Six here, AMD and Intel are heavily embattled. This is one of the key battlegrounds in the benchmarks that we're using right now, where they keep passing each other almost every generation, which makes it really interesting to watch. The 13th gen might shake this up again a little bit, and right now, the rank is not meaningfully differentiated at that very top end. So until either the game, we get something harder to run on the CPUs, or the 13th gen really introduces some higher power parts for this type of workload, it looks like we're kind of hitting the cap for what we're going to see on Rainbow Six Siege. So in fact, there is not no cap, there is a cap, and it's a GPU limitation eventually. Or memory, but there's limitations at some point. It appears to be over 600 FPS. Far Cry 6 introduces more of a graphics challenge for the GPU. We still see scaling most of the way up the chart here, but it diminishes as we approach the 58X 3D, which still holds on to its prior lead. We previously pointed out that the 12900K and 7950X are both tripping over scheduling conflicts with Far Cry and Windows specifically, resulting in the dips and 0.1% lows that you're seeing. In this frame time chart from our 7950X review, you can see the problem at play. It wasn't game-breaking, and it's only occasionally noticeable, but it's still a high core count specific problem. That was the 7950X though, so let's go to the new data. Back to the bar chart, the 7900X ends up at 172 FPS average here, which has it just behind the 7950X while maintaining better scheduling in the lows. The 129K leads the 79X by only 2%, with the 58X 3D ahead by 5%. Generationally, AMD jumped ahead of its 59X's 146 FPS average by 18%, or it jumped 49% over the 3900X to the new one. Not as large a generational jump as we saw with the, say, 3600 to the 7600X, but still consistent for gains over the years. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is far more consistent with Far Cry in its behavior as opposed to, say, CSGO. It's not as ridiculously high frame rate as some of the others. The 79X operated at 261 FPS average and kept frames consistent. That has it 3 FPS behind the 7950X, meaning the 7950X has only a 0.8% lead, so basically error. They're the same. The 7600X is also the same from mostly a user standpoint. It's indistinguishable in its differences, but it's measurably different, and it allows the 7900X a 2.4% lead. Overall, anything from a 59X and up will feel about the same here, though there are clear and real gains all the way up to the 58X3D. And AMD's X3D CPU is still dominating in scenarios where the cache is more useful than more cores or clocks. At 1440p, Tomb Raider becomes GPU bound all the way down to the 5600X. In this situation, the 79X represents an upgrade over true budget CPUs or Zen 2 options. Zen 2 architecture is showing its age now, but eventually the GPU constrains the gains. In F1 2022 at 1080p, the 79X puts a 340 FPS average result up and has consistent frame times as well. It performs identically to the less expensive 7600X in all three of those metrics here. These are within error more or less, giving the 76X a clear advantage in gaming-only tasks. The 7950X and 58X3D technically lead, but it's by less than 4% here. Compared to previous generations of Ryzen, the 79X leads the 59X by 12%. The 3900X is led by 52%, and the original Zen 1 1700 is led by a massive 124% improvement with the 7900X, where both clock speed and IPC are on full display. Moving to 1440p, the scaling gets tighter at the top of the chart as it becomes GPU bound. Though the 7900X is technically on the top of the chart with a 301 FPS average, the performance is identical down to the 7600X. We actually can't really see the differences once the GPU is choking the workload because the frame delivery becomes more sporadic and less consistent run to run, which means from a methodological perspective, you really can't declare strong confidence in establishing a difference because there is none. We can't test it here. This chart can still show some differences, just not until the Ryzen 5000 series and below. Here, the 79X is 6% higher FPS average than the 59X and 36% over the 3900X, although that may scale further if we weren't limited. And finally, we're back to the same bottleneck discussion as in the 7950X review. This applies to Cyberpunk, Total Warhammer 3, and GTA 5. These games are now showing situations where we're graphics limited for at least part of the chart, negating their usefulness as a CPU test. These numbers can't be used to determine which CPU is better because they're all jumbled on the GPU. These are useful, though, as a reminder of when the GPU becomes more relevant than the CPU and how hard it is to create a CPU bottleneck these days. So wrapping things up then, the 7900X, again, it's doing well. We didn't run into any major issues other than the same issues we talked about in the 7950X review, which were some stability and initial BIOS flashing problems. And also, it's really picky about changing the CPU in the socket, but because people don't generally do that very often, it's not something we're complaining a lot about. It's more of sort of like a test environment issue, like on this machine back here, where it has probably had, I don't know, like 20 CPUs go through that corner in the last couple days. So not something you need to worry about. But boot times are a little frustrating. Flashing for at least the early Asus BIOSes, maybe that's gotten better, was frustrating. But once it's up and running, it does seem to be stable and functional. So the biggest points we have right now, AMD is ceding ground to the low end. So Intel is recapturing that market, and AMD is letting them run with it. So if they come out in the 13th gen and quickly launch low-end parts, AMD's really just, they're basically saying, we don't even want it. We just want the high price parts. You can have the cheap stuff, which is weird because it was the opposite way about 5 years ago. As for this stuff, the 7950X is the most obvious alternative to the 7900X without going to high-end desktop or HEDT like Threadripper or whatever Intel does next. And so for that comparison, the 7950X versus the 7900X, what you need to know is this quick recap. Blender, the 7950X is about 25% faster in rendering frames with our testing. Chromium, it was about 19% faster in compiling in Windows, this is with ClaneCL. And then in 7-zip, the 7950X was about 18% faster, at least for compression, versus the 7900X. No real difference in Photoshop back there. Actually, the 7900X was a little bit faster in the test running behind me than the 7950, and that's because of that thermal boosting headroom. So the extra threads were not utilized as we test it back there. And then Premiere, no real difference there either. So also gaming, not much of a difference, basically none. So that's the recap. Now, 7950 makes sense if you are really just running production workloads nonstop, you're rendering stuff overnight, you need to use the CPU for it. It starts to make sense to maybe spend that extra money if you're making money with your computer to the extent that you are actually bottlenecked. Like let's say you're hired for animations and the thing that's limiting you is you can't render them fast enough. And if that's the case, it makes sense to spend the money because it should alleviate the pipeline so that you can make more money. But if you are mostly an enthusiast, the 7900X, just like the 5900X and 3900X before it, is an extremely good enthusiast class part, is how we'd qualify it. So 7950 is kind of like you're in basically professional territory. Obviously, enthusiasts can buy it, but it is a little bit much. The 7900X, though, at $550 starts to make more sense as like a balanced, you really enjoy just high-end computers in general, and you have production workloads you would like to run on them, but you're maybe not bound up by it and bottlenecked on that as your ability to make money. For competition, Intel doesn't have a lot right now. The 12900K is kind of there sometimes. The 13900K, we'll see. That's going to be the key competition, though. But for now, it's kind of standing alone, other than obviously older parts to consider as maybe a more value-oriented alternative, and there's plenty of those, or something like Threadripper if you want a lot more threads. But it's weird. Right now, Intel's kind of given up that HADT market, and AMD's given up the low-end market, so they can both exist peacefully in their own areas until they start competing directly in those areas again. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go watch the 7950X reviews for some more behind the scenes and details on how this stuff works. And to support us, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab things like our coaster packs or our mod mats, which are in stock and shipping now. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd just like to help fund some of our reporting and our long hours of testing this past week. All of this came together in just a couple days, like 4 or 5 days, for all the testing you see on all those charts. It was crazy, but we love doing it for you all. So thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.